What if I told you, money was once used to control you, before you were even born? Not just to buy things, not just to trade, but to shape entire nations, and decide who becomes rich, and who stays poor. Pause. Because this is not just history. This is the system. You are still living inside today. Think back to where this journey started. In episode 1, you discovered the biggest lie. That money is not paper, not your bank balance, not your salary. You learned that most people don't understand money. They only understand currency. And that confusion is where the problem begins. Then in episode 2, we went back to the beginning. Before banks, before coins, before trade, when money was simple, your energy was your money. Your strength, your skill, your ability to survive. But there was a problem. You could not store it. You could not grow it. You could not pass it on. Then came episode 3. Everything changed. Land became wealth. Production created surplus. And for the first time, wealth could be stored. Power was no longer just strength. It became ownership. Kings emerged. Systems formed. Society was structured. Then in episode 4, humans tried to exchange value. Barter was born. Yam for fish, salt for cloth. Simple, direct, but limited. Because you had to want what I had. At the same time I wanted what you had. And when that didn't happen, trade stopped. Growth slowed. So in episode 5, a breakthrough happened. Calories, for the first time. Value could move freely. You could sell today, and buy tomorrow. Trade expanded. Markets grew. Wealth started flowing. But something else happened. Something subtle. Something dangerous. Control began to shift. Now pause, look at the pattern. From energy, to land, to exchange, to money. Every stage solved a problem. But every solution created a new system. And whoever controlled that system, controlled the wealth. Now we arrive here. Episode 6. The moment everything changed, because money stopped being just a tool for exchange, and became a tool for control. So let me ask you again, if money is supposed to represent value, why do some nations produce value, but never seem to keep wealth? Why do people work hard, yet remain stuck? What if the system was never designed for them to win? Because in this episode, you are about to see the truth. How trade became exploitation, how value became extraction, and how money was used to control an entire continent. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because this is not just history. This is the foundation of the system you are living in today. Today, you wake up early, you rush through traffic, you show up, you work. At the end of the month, you receive salary, and for a moment, you feel safe, relieved, in control. Then a few days pass. Bills come in, rent, food, transport, family responsibilities, and slowly, that feeling disappears. Now you check your bank balance again. And everything changes. Same person, same effort, but now you feel broke. Pause. Think about that. How can your value as a human being change just because of numbers on a screen? You see someone holding cash, driving a nice car, living a certain lifestyle, and immediately, your mind tells you they have power, they have made it. But you don't ask, what system are they operating in? How is their money being created? And more importantly, is it sustainable? Because here is the truth most people never stop to question. You are not just living in an economy. You are living inside a design system. A system with rules, a system with patterns, a system with winners and losers. In many Nigerian homes, the script is the same. Go to school, get a good job, earn a stable income. It sounds responsible. It sounds safe. It sounds like the right path, but listen carefully. That instruction was never designed to make you wealthy. It was designed to make you functional, to make you fit into the system, to make you survive within it. Because no one sits you down and explains where this system came from, why jobs exist the way they do, why salaries are structured the way they are, why some people control opportunities, while others compete for them. So you grow up believing money equals job, money equals salary, money equals bank alert. And once that belief is locked in, your entire life begins to follow a pattern. You don't think about building systems. You think about finding jobs. You don't think about creating value at scale. You think about earning monthly. You don't think about ownership. You think about stability. That is not understanding money. That is adapting to a system you didn't question. And here is where it becomes dangerous. Because when you don't question a system, you cannot see its limits. And when you cannot see its limits, you cannot escape them. So you work harder. You push more. You sacrifice time, energy, health, but your results stay within a range, a ceiling you cannot explain. And you start asking questions like, why am I working so hard but not moving forward? Why does it feel like I'm always starting over every month? Why does money come and go so fast? But the real question is this: are you struggling because you are not working hard enough? Or because you are operating inside a system that was never built for your growth? Because the truth is, you can spend your entire life mastering effort and still remain stuck if you never understand the system that controls the outcome. And that is exactly what this episode is about. Because the system you are living in today did not just appear, it was built, layer by layer, decision by decision, power by power. And once you see how it was built, you will finally understand something most people never realize. Your struggle is not just personal. It is structural. And when you understand the structure, that is when your thinking begins to change. That is when your strategy begins to change. That is when your life can begin to change. Let's simplify this. No big grammar. No complex economics. Just numbers. Imagine this. A community produces 100 units of raw materials. Cocoa, palm oil, minerals, human labor. Real value, real effort, real time. Those materials are exported. They leave the land. They leave the people. They leave the source. In return, that same community receives goods worth 40 units. Finished products, imported items, refined goods. Now pause, look at it slowly. They produced 100, but only kept 40. Where did the 60 go? Who captured it? Who benefited from it? Because that missing 60 is not just numbers. It is lost wealth, lost opportunity, lost future. Now stretch this pattern over years, decades, generations. 100 becomes 1,000. 1,000 becomes 1 million. 1 million becomes billions. And that missing gap becomes the difference between developed nations and developing nations, between wealth creators and resource suppliers. That is not just trade. That is wealth extraction. Now bring it closer to home. Your life, your reality. You wake up, you work, you use your time, your energy, your skills, you create value. At the end of the month, you are paid. Let's say 100,000, but now track it. Rent takes a part, food takes a part, transport takes a part, bills take a part, family responsibilities take a part. Before you realize what is left, 20,000, 10,000, sometimes nothing. Now pause again. You created value worth 100. But how much did you actually keep? And even that small amount, does it grow? Or does it disappear again next month? Now think deeper. Is the problem that you are not working hard enough? Or is it that the structure you are in is designed for continuous outflow? Because just like that community, you are producing, you are giving, you are contributing, but the system around you determines how much you keep. And if you don't understand that system, you will keep repeating the same cycle. Work, earn, spend, reset. Work, earn, spend, reset. Years pass. Energy goes, time disappears. But wealth does not stay. So here is the real question. How much of the value you create do you actually keep? Because wealth is not just about earning more. It is about keeping more, controlling more, multiplying more. And if you don't understand where your missing 60 is going, you will spend your whole life chasing money without ever building wealth. And that is the deeper problem most people never see until it is too late. Let me ask you something. And I don't want you to rush this. If a system is designed to take more from you than it gives back, can you truly become wealthy inside it? Without understanding it, pause. Don't scroll. Don't skip this, because this question is not about money. It's about your life. Think about your daily routine. You wake up. You give your time. You give your energy. You give your attention. You give your skills, and at the end, you are paid a portion, not the full value, a portion. Now ask yourself honestly, do you understand how that portion is decided? Do you understand who controls the system? Do you understand where the rest of the value goes, or are you just participating? Pause. Let it sink in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now the answer, no. You cannot become truly wealthy inside a system you do not understand. Because if you don't understand the system, you will only operate within its limits, and those limits are invisible. They don't look like chains, they look like routine. They look like normal life, they look like monthly salary, monthly bills, yearly repetition. But behind that normal, there is structure. And that structure decides how much you earn, how much you keep, how much you lose. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Those limits were not created for your freedom. They were created for stability, for control, for continuity of the system itself. So you can work harder and still stay within the same range. You can earn more and still feel stuck. You can try your best and still not break through. Not because you are not capable, but because you are playing a game without knowing the rules. And in every system, the people who understand the rules control the outcome. So the real question is not, can I make more money? The real question is, do I understand the system that controls money? Because the moment you understand it, something shifts. You stop reacting, and you start positioning. You stop guessing, and you start seeing. And that shift is where wealth truly begins. After carries, after trade expanded, after markets grew, something changed, quietly, slowly, but permanently. Trade stopped being equal. It stopped being simple exchange. It became strategic, calculated, controlled. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, new players entered the system. European powers, Portugal, the United Kingdom, France. At first, it looked harmless. They came with ships, with goods, with promises of trade, and Africa welcomed them. Because trade had always been part of the system. Exchange was normal, connection was opportunity. But something was different this time. This was not just trade between equals. This was trade backed by power, technology, weapons, navigation, organization, and slowly, the balance began to shift. At first, they exchanged goods, textiles for resources, metal for produce, simple, familiar, but then, the focus changed. It was no longer about, what do you have that I need? It became, what do you have that I can control? And that is when trade turned into something darker. Human beings became commodities, strong men, taken, sold, transported, across oceans, entire communities, disrupted, broken, weakened. Because when you remove people, you remove labor. When you remove labor, you remove production. When you remove production, you weaken an economy. And while Africa was losing its people, Europe was gaining labor, expanding industries, building wealth. Pause. Let that sink in. This was no longer trade. This was extraction. Value was no longer exchange. It was taken. And the system evolved again, from barter, to money, to controlled trade, to controlled economies. But it didn't stop there. Because after the slave trade, came something even more structured, even more organized, even more powerful. Colonial control. The British didn't just trade in Nigeria. They took control of the system itself. Through entities like the Royal Niger Company. They controlled trade routes, resources, decisions, and in 1914, everything was consolidated. Lord Frederick Lugard amalgamated the northern and southern protectorates, not for unity, but for administrative and economic control. Now Nigeria was no longer just a land. It became a system within a larger system. A system designed for one purpose, extraction. Raw materials moved out, finished goods came in. Palm oil, cocoa, ground nuts, exported. Manufactured goods, imported. And once again, the pattern repeated. Produce more, keep less. But the most powerful shift was this: money itself was taken out of local control. The currency system changed. No longer carries. No longer local systems. now controlled by the British through the West African Currency Board, which meant Africa could produce value, but could not control the money tied to that value. Pause. Think about that. If you don't control your currency, do you truly control your economy? Because money is not just a tool, it is power. And once money was controlled externally, so was the future. And this is where the real story begins. Because the system that was built then did not disappear, it evolved, and parts of it still exist today, quiet, invisible, but powerful. And unless you understand it, you will keep participating in it, without ever realizing why it feels like you are always giving more than you are keeping. Africa was no longer just exporting goods. Something deeper, something more destructive, began. It started exporting people. Human beings became commodities, not traders, not partners, products. Young men, taken, because they were strong, because they could work, because they could build. Young women, taken, because they could produce, because they could sustain life, because they carried the future. Children, taken, because they were potential, because they were tomorrow's labor, tomorrow's builders, tomorrow's strength. Entire generations, removed. Now imagine this clearly. A village wakes up, and its strongest people are gone. The farmers, the protectors, the skilled, gone. What happens next? Farms stop producing at full capacity. Trade slows down. Families break. Communities weaken. Not because people became lazy, but because the system removed their strength. Now pause, think deeply. If your strongest workforce is removed, what happens to your economy? It slows. It weakens. It struggles to sustain itself. And when a system weakens long enough, it becomes dependent on external goods, external systems, external control. And that dependency becomes a new form of control, because now, you don't just trade with others, you rely on them. And the moment you rely on someone else for survival, power shifts. This was not random, it was not accidental. It was not just history happening. It was structural, designed, systematic. Value was extracted, not just from the land, but from the people, time, energy, strength, future generations, all removed and redirected. And while one side was losing its ability to grow, the other side was accelerating, building industries, expanding economies, accumulating wealth. So when you look at global inequality today, you have to understand something. It did not start today. It was built, step by step, layer by layer, decision by decision. And at the center of it all was control. Control of people, control of labor, control of value. Because once you control those three, you don't just influence an economy, you shape its future. And this is where the system becomes even deeper. Because after removing people, after weakening systems, the next step was not just to take, but to replace local systems, replace local control, replace local money. And that is where the next level of control begins. In 1807, the British Empire officially announced the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. On paper, it looked like a turning point in human history, a moment where one of the darkest economic systems was finally brought to an end. But history rarely works the way it appears on paper. Because while laws can change overnight, systems take much longer to disappear. And sometimes, they don't disappear at all. They only evolve. So what really changed? The truth is uncomfortable. The trade did not end. It transformed. Instead of human beings being treated as commodities, a new form of value exchange quietly emerged. The focus shifted from people to resources, from bodies to raw materials, and almost immediately, a new economic direction began to take shape across West Africa. The same regions that once fed the transatlantic slave routes were reorganized into supply zones for industrial Europe. Now the exports were different. Palm oil, cocoa, rubber, groundnuts, not because these crops were suddenly more important, but because the global system had changed what it demanded. This new structure was given a calm, official name, legitimate commerce. But beneath that phrase was something far more powerful. The continuation of extraction, under a different identity, and slowly, the entire economic geography of West Africa began to shift. Communities that once participated in human trade networks were restructured into production zones, not for local consumption, but for external industries. Ports like Lagos, Calabar, Bonny became even more important, but not as centers of independence. Instead, they became gateways of export, channels through which value left the continent, and rarely returned in equal measure, and without most people realizing it. A deeper transformation was happening. African economies were being reprogrammed, not to control trade, not to define value, but to supply it. Now pause here, because this is where the illusion breaks. If a system is officially banned, but its structure remains intact, has it truly ended? Or has it simply changed form to survive? Because this is the hidden pattern of history. Systems rarely die when they are resisted. They adapt, they reorganize, they rename themselves, and they continue in a form that is harder to recognize. And this is the most important lesson of this entire era. Systems don't always disappear when they are stopped. They evolve when they are challenged, and they survive by changing their appearance. So when we study the abolition of 1807, we are not just studying the end of a trade. We are witnessing the birth of a new economic structure, one that no longer relied on human export, but on resource extraction. And this is why this moment in history matters deeply, because it reveals something timeless. Control does not always need force. Sometimes, it only needs transformation. And from this point forward, the story of money in West Africa enters a new and more organized phase of extraction, one that would shape economies, borders, and the future of entire nations. And what comes next will show how that system became even more structured, even more powerful, and even more invisible after slavery began to decline. The system did not end, it evolved, because the goal was never just people. The goal was always value, so when human export reduced, another system replaced it, stronger, more organized, less visible. Colonial extraction. Now Africa was no longer seen as a place of people. It was seen as a source, a supply zone, a production ground. Africa was positioned as a supplier of raw materials. Palm oil, cocoa, rubber, cotton, resources pulled directly from the land, from the soil, from the sweat of the people. These materials were not finished. They were not refined. They were not maximized. They were exported, sent out, moved across oceans, to Europe, and there. Something critical happened. Those same raw materials were processed, transformed, upgraded. Palm oil became industrial products. Cocoa became chocolate. Rubber became tires. Cotton became textiles. Value increased, not because the raw material changed, but because of processing, systems, technology, control. Then, those finished goods were sent back to the same place they came from, but now, at a higher price. Pause. Look at the pattern carefully. You produce, you export, they process, they profit, you import, you pay more. That is not just trade. That is a cycle. Produce cheap, sell cheap, buy expensive. Again. Produce cheap, sell cheap, buy expensive. Now stretch that cycle. Over years, over decades, over generations. What do you get? A system where value leaves continuously, but wealth never stays, because wealth is not just in production. Wealth is in processing, control, ownership, and in this system, those three things were not local. So even though Africa was working, producing, exporting, the real value was being captured elsewhere. And that is how wealth leaves a system. Not suddenly, not loudly, but consistently. Little by little, year by year, generation by generation. Until one side becomes a producer, without power, and the other becomes a controller, with wealth. Now pause again. Bring it back to your life. Are you just producing value, or are you also controlling it? Are you just earning, or are you building systems? Because if you are only producing, without control, without ownership, without leverage, then you are closer to the beginning of the cycle than the end of it. And that is the difference between working for money and building wealth. And this is where the system goes even deeper. because controlling resources was not enough. The next level was controlling money itself. Then came the next phase, not just control of trade, but control of structure, because controlling resources was powerful, but controlling the system itself, that was permanent. So the approach changed again, from influence to centralization. Through the Royal Niger Company, trade was no longer scattered. It was organized, directed, controlled from the top. Routes were monitored, resources were tracked, decisions were no longer local. Power began to concentrate. And then, in 1914, something happened that would shape everything that followed. Lord Frederick Lugard amalgamated the northern and southern protectorates. On the surface, it looked like unity, one country, one structure, one identity, but pause, look deeper. This was not done for cultural alignment. It was not done for shared vision. It was not done for internal growth. It was done for administrative efficiency and economic control. Because managing two regions separately was harder, more expensive, less efficient, but combining them, easier to control, easier to manage, easier to extract from. So Nigeria was formed, not as a nation built from the inside, but as a structure designed from the outside. A system, carefully arranged, carefully aligned, and at its core was one purpose: extraction. Resources moved outward. Decisions came from above. Control stayed external. Internal development was not the priority. Because when a system is designed for extraction, growth is not evenly distributed. Some areas produce, some areas consume, but the system itself determines who benefits the most. Now pause, think about this. If the foundation of a system is not designed for your growth, what happens when you operate inside it, without questioning it? You adapt, you adjust, you survive, but you rarely break beyond it. And that is why understanding history is not just about the past. It is about seeing why things are the way they are, why certain patterns repeat, why effort alone sometimes feels not enough. Because the structure you are operating in was built with a specific purpose, and unless you understand that purpose, you will keep working inside the system without ever realizing why it feels like the system is always ahead of you. Then came the most powerful tool of all. Not land, not trade, not even resources, but something far more invisible. Money itself, because whoever controls money doesn't just control trade. They control behavior, they control decisions, they control economies. And that is when a new system was introduced, the West African Currency Board. On the surface, it looked like organization, stability, structure, but underneath, it was control, because this system determined how money was created, how money entered circulation, how money was distributed, how money could be used, and most importantly, it removed local control. Nigeria no longer controlled its own currency. Money became external, not just a tool, but a policy, a structure, a decision made elsewhere. And here is the critical truth: when you don't control money, you don't control your economy, because money is not just paper. It is not just coins. It is not just exchange. Money is the command system of an economy. It decides who can trade, who can scale, who can invest, who can grow. Now pause, think deeply. If the system that defines your money is not designed or controlled by you, what does that mean for your freedom? Because even if you are working hard, even if you are producing value, even if you are contributing to the system, the rules of reward are not fully in your hands. And that is why currency control is the highest form of economic influence, because once you control money, you don't need to control everything else directly. The system begins to control itself, and people begin to adjust their lives around something they don't even question. But here is the deeper truth. This was not just about the past. It is about understanding how systems work today. Because even now, money still flows through structures that most people never see. And the people who understand this don't just work harder, they position differently. They think differently, they build differently. Because they understand one thing clearly: money is not just what you earn. It is what the system allows you to keep. And once you see that, you can never look at money the same way again. Wealth doesn't just change because people work harder. Wealth changes when control shifts. From individuals to systems, from communities to structures, from producers to controllers. And once control shifts, even hard work begins to produce different outcomes. Imagine a young farmer in a pre-colonial Nigerian village. He wakes up early, the sun is soft, the land is rich. The system is simple. He produces food, yam, maize, palm produce. He takes it to the local market. People around him know him. They trust him. They exchange fairly. He receives cowries. And those cowries mean something powerful. He can trade again. He can save value. He can plan ahead. Most importantly, his value stays inside his community. He is not disconnected from what he produces. He is part of it. Now pause. This is the first system. Local control of value. Now fast forward. Same land. Same farmer. Same effort. Same discipline. But the system has changed. Now he produces raw materials. Not just for his community, but for external markets. Agents arrive. Colonial trade structures are in place. Rules are different. Prices are no longer local. They are determined elsewhere. He sells his produce, but not into his own system. He sells into a larger controlled structure. He receives currency. But that currency is not controlled locally. It is defined externally. Now something subtle happens, but very important. His value begins to move away from him. He earns, but does not control pricing. He produces, but does not control demand. He sells, but does not control distribution. And then he spends on imported goods at prices he did not set. So now, his value flows outward, not inward. Pause. Let that sink in. The same effort, the same land, the same farmer, but a completely different outcome, because the system changed. Not the person. Now fast forward again, bring it to today. You are working. You are earning. You are producing value. But ask yourself honestly, is your value staying with you, or is it flowing through systems you don't control? You control how your income is created. Do you control how it is valued? Do you control how far it goes? Or are you simply operating inside a system that already defines those things for you? Now here is the deep lesson inside this framework. Effort alone does not determine wealth anymore. Control does. Control over income streams, pricing, distribution, systems, skills, demand. Because when you control the system, your effort multiplies, but when you don't, your effort is limited, no matter how strong you are. When you look closely at this framework, one truth becomes unavoidable. You can put in the same effort as someone else and still end up with completely different outcomes, simply because the system around you is different. Wealth is not only about what you create, but about what is captured or lost along the way depending on who holds the control. If you are not aware of where your money goes after you earn it, then you are not yet thinking like someone who understands wealth at its core. Because in reality, systems influence rewards far more than effort ever will. And that forces a deeper question: not how hard are you working, but who actually controls the environment in which your work is being valued. From that understanding, the direction becomes clearer. You begin to pay attention to the movement of your money after it enters your hands, not just the moment you earn it. You start learning how to position yourself in places where you don't only participate in value creation, but gradually gain influence over it. You also begin to reduce overdependence on a single stream of income, because you now understand that relying on one system limits your ability to grow within it. At the same time, you start studying how systems actually function, how pricing is decided, how distribution works, how digital platforms scale value, and how ownership quietly shapes outcomes. And most importantly, you begin positioning yourself inside systems where your value can expand beyond survival into scale. And once this shift becomes clear in your thinking, something deeper begins to emerge in your understanding of money history itself. You start to realize that the next stage was no longer just about who controlled trade or who controlled resources. It was about something far more powerful: who controls currency itself. And from that point forward, everything changes again. This was not just Nigeria. This was not even just Africa. This was global. At the same time these systems were forming in Africa, Europe was undergoing something massive. The Industrial Revolution. Factories were rising. Machines were replacing manual labor. Production was scaling at a level the world had never seen before, but factories needed something critical. Raw materials, constant supply, cheap input. And this is where colonies became important, because Africa was rich in resources, but not in industrial power at that time, so the system connected both sides. Europe equals manufacturing and processing. Colonies equals raw material supply. Cotton left Africa. Rubber left Africa. Cocoa left Africa. Palm oil left Africa. They were transformed elsewhere, then returned as finished goods. At a higher value, a higher price, a higher profit margin. Then came the next global shift, the gold standard, where money systems were tied to gold reserves, and countries needed global credibility to issue currency. Later, global trade systems expanded, international banks emerged, financial institutions were formed, rules were standardized. But here is the key insight. All of these systems were built on one foundation: efficiency of production and control of value flow. And Africa was inserted into this global structure, but not as an equal participant. It was integrated, but not empowered, connected, but not controlling, positioned at the bottom of the value chain, meaning raw materials left the continent at low value, finished goods returned at high value, and the difference was captured elsewhere. Now pause, think carefully. If you are always producing, but never processing, never owning, never controlling distribution, where does the real wealth go? It doesn't stay where production happens. It stays where value is multiplied. And that is the global lesson here. It was never just about resources. It was about position in the system. Because in any economy, the one who controls processing controls pricing. The one who controls pricing controls profit. And this structure still echoes in today's global economy, just in different forms. More digital, more invisible, but still structured. And this is why understanding history matters. Because once you see the system clearly, you stop only asking, how do I earn more? And start asking, where is value actually created and captured? Here is the truth most people never stop to think about. Money is not just currency. Money is not just paper. Not coins, not bank alerts, not digital numbers on a screen. Money is something deeper. It is control of value. Because money represents stored human time, transferable value, proof of problems solved. Every time someone earns money, what they are really being paid for is time they gave, value they created, problems they solved. But here is where the system becomes important. When systems are designed externally, your value does not always reach you directly. It passes through layers, structures, controls, rules, and in those layers, value can be reduced, redirected, or extracted before it ever reaches your hands. That is why two people can work equally hard, but get completely different outcomes, not always because of effort, but because of position inside the system. Now pause for a moment. If effort alone guaranteed wealth, then everyone working hard would be rich. But you already know that is not true, so something else must be at play. And that something is understanding how money moves, understanding how systems distribute value, understanding where wealth is actually created. Because in every economy, there is a path that value follows. And whoever understands that path moves differently, earns differently, builds differently. But whoever does not understand it only sees the surface, salary, income, survival, and remains trapped inside effort, without ever stepping into structure. That is why some people work endlessly, but still struggle to build wealth, not because they are not trying, but because effort without understanding systems is incomplete. And this is the real shift this series is trying to show you. Wealth is not just about working harder. It is about understanding how value flows, and positioning yourself where value is captured. Because once you see the system clearly, you stop chasing money blindly, and start thinking like someone who understands where money actually comes from. So what does this really mean for you in today's world? It means something most people feel but cannot explain. Salary is fragile, not because it is bad, but because it exists inside a system. A system you do not control, a system that can change at any time. Job structures can shift, industries can evolve, entire companies can disappear, And when that happens, salary disappears with it. So salary was never designed to be wealth. It was designed to be stability within a system. Now pause. Because this is where most people misunderstand money. They think the goal is to earn more, but earning more inside a limited system still keeps you inside the limit. So what actually changes outcomes? Positioning. Wealth is not just about how much you earn. It is about where you stand in the flow of value. Because the system always has layers. Those who produce, those who process, those who distribute, those who own. And wealth increases as you move upward in that structure. Now here is the modern truth. Those who win today are not just hardworking, they are system aware. They understand business systems, digital systems, global systems. They understand how value moves across platforms, not just how effort moves in a job. And today, the world has shifted again. The old colonial system is no longer physical, it is digital. It now exists through platforms that control attention, algorithms that control visibility, systems that control distribution, networks that control opportunity. And just like before, those who understand the system early move first, position first, benefit first. While others are still trying to work harder inside an outdated model, they are already adapting to the new one. Because every era has its own form of power, and in this era, power is no longer just land, or factories, or raw materials. It is attention, information, distribution, access. And the people who understand this early don't just earn money, they build leverage. And that is the difference between working inside the system and understanding how to move with the system. Because once you see this clearly, you stop competing for salary and start positioning for value flow. This is where the real weight of this episode hits. Because once you understand how money has evolved from barter to cowries to colonial systems, you begin to see something uncomfortable. Money is not neutral. It has never been neutral. It is not just a tool that sits quietly in your hands. It can be shaped, directed, controlled. And when it is controlled, it controls behavior, it controls choices, it even controls entire futures without people realizing it. And this leads to the second truth: systems determine outcomes more than effort. Not because effort doesn't matter, but because effort only works inside a structure. And if the structure is designed in a certain way, then no matter how hard you try, your results are still filtered through that design. Now think deeply, because this is where most people get stuck. They believe, if I just work harder, I will escape. But history shows something different. It is not always the hardest worker who wins. It is the one who understands how the system distributes reward. And that leads to another hidden reality. Wealth flows where control exists. Not where effort exists, not where activity exists, but where control exists. Control of trade, control of systems, control of distribution, control of value. And once control is established, wealth naturally moves toward it, quietly, consistently, over time. Now pause here for a moment, because this is where the pattern becomes personal. History is not just something that happened. History is something you are still living inside. The systems created long ago did not disappear. They evolved, they changed form. But the structure of value flow still remains, and that is why history shapes present financial realities. Because what you see today in income, opportunity, and wealth distribution is not random. It is layered on top of decisions made long before you were born. And finally, the deepest truth of all in this episode: understanding money is understanding power, not political power alone, but structural power, the power of systems, the power of distribution, the power of positioning. Because once you understand how money has moved through history, you stop seeing it as something you chase, and start seeing it as something that flows through systems. Start learning how money systems actually work deeply. Not at the surface level of salary, savings, and spending, but at the level of flow, where money comes from, how it moves, who controls it, and where it accumulates. Because once you understand flow, you stop guessing. You start seeing patterns. Build skills that are globally valuable, not skills that only work in one place, or depend on one employer, or one economy. Because when your value is global, your opportunities are no longer local. and that changes everything about your future. Reduce dependence on one income source. Because one source of income means one point of failure. And history has already shown. Systems change, jobs disappear, industries collapse. But people who build multiple streams survive shifts that destroy others. Study history to understand present systems. Because what looks like today's economy is actually yesterday's structure in a new form. And those who recognize patterns early stop reacting and start anticipating. Position yourself in growing economic trends, not yesterday's opportunities, not crowded spaces where everyone is already struggling, but the early stages of what is coming next. Because the biggest wealth shifts do not reward those who arrive late. They reward those who arrive early enough to understand the direction of change. Now pause, think carefully, because in every system of wealth that has ever existed, there is always a moment before everything becomes obvious, a moment where most people ignore it, and a few people recognize it. And those few are the ones who change everything, because in the end, it is not just about working harder, about seeing earlier, understanding earlier, positioning earlier. And that is why this series exists, to help you see what most people will only understand when it is already too late. Because those who understand early win early, right now. You are seeing something most people never see in their entire lifetime. Not just history, not just economics, but the hidden structure behind money itself. Because money is not just what you earn at the end of the month. It is not just salary. It is not just cash in your hand. It is not even just numbers in your bank account. Money is deeper than that. It is the system you operate inside. And that system decides far more than most people realize. It influences what you earn, what you keep, what you lose, and how far your effort can actually take you. And here is the uncomfortable truth. If you don't understand the system, you will keep working. Without truly building, you will stay active. Without being positioned, you will stay busy, without moving forward. That is why this journey is not just about watching episodes. It is about understanding structure. Because once structure is clear, confusion disappears, and direction begins. And this is exactly why I created something deeper for you. A guide that brings everything together. The book, The First Millionaire in Your Family. This is not just a book, it is a system of thinking. A reset of everything you believe about money. A step-by-step breakdown of how wealth is actually built from zero. Especially if you are starting with nothing. Inside this book, you will not find motivation. You will find clarity. You will not find guesswork. You will find structure. You will not find theory. You will find direction. It will help you understand why most people stay stuck financially, why hard work alone is not enough, how money actually flows in real systems, and how to start positioning yourself differently. People who have gone through it often say, "It changed the way I see money completely. It made me realize I've been thinking about wealth the wrong way. It gave me clarity I never had before." Because that is the real power of the book. It doesn't just give information. It changes perception. And when perception changes, your decisions change. And when your decisions change, your life changes. So if you are serious about breaking out of cycles, if you are serious about building something different, if you are serious about becoming the first in your family to truly understand wealth, then don't delay this. The link is in the description. Go and get the book. Study it slowly, apply it deeply, and let it reshape how you think about money. And if you are still here, that means something in you is already waking up. Don't ignore that feeling. Because the difference between people who stay the same and people who transform is not knowledge, it is action. So act now, start now, build now, and remember this. You are not just watching content. You are either building a new financial future or repeating an old one. The choice is yours, but now pause. Because everything you just learned was only one layer of the story. We saw how money moved from trade to control to systems that shaped entire nations. But here is the question most people never ask. If money was controlled externally and value was extracted through systems, then what happens when the system itself changes again? Because history does not stay still. It evolves, it upgrades, it restructures human life completely. And the next shift was one of the biggest in human history. A shift that did not just change money. It changed how humans live, work, and think forever. Factories replaced farms. Machines replaced manual labor. Time itself became measurable value. And for the first time in history, a new system was born, where your life is no longer paid for by what you produce, but by how long you are present. This is where everything changes, because this is where the world introduced something most people still live inside today, without questioning it, the salary system. And once this system entered society, money stopped being about ownership, and started becoming about hours, about employment, about survival inside a structure. And that is where the next chapter begins, not in markets, not in trade, but inside factories, schools, and systems designed to organize human time. Because once you understand how this shift happened, you will finally understand why most people today are not building wealth, but trading time. And when you see it clearly, you will never look at work the same again. So in the next episode, we go deeper into the system that quietly shaped modern life, how the Industrial Revolution created the salary world you live in today, and why most people are still stuck inside it, without realizing it, because once again, money didn't just evolve, human behavior did, and the system evolved with it. This channel is not about motivation, it is about transformation. Every video you watch here is one step closer to becoming the first millionaire in your family. Not through luck, not through hype, but through discipline, structure, and long-term thinking. We are building thinkers. We are building investors. We are building legacy creators. And if you stay here long enough, apply what you learn, and study the blueprint inside the first millionaire in your family, you won't just change your income, you'll change your bloodline. So if this video shifted your thinking even a little, subscribe, because this is not just content. This is preparation. And 10 years from now, you'll either look back and say, I started when it was small, or I wish I did. Choose wisely. I'll see you in the next lesson.